Hey, welcome to Code Reviews. Before you click away in disgust, this is what we're going to be doing. Extending Spring Security to enrich a Google JSON Web Token. Let's go through the demo. We have our app per usual. We try to create a new user. It tells us we're not authorized. We try to delete a user. It tells us we're not authorized. When you look at the back end, at our controller, and the user controller, you can see that we've added this PreAuthorize tag. So delete user, you need the subscribed user role. To get enabled users, you need a free user role. And to create a user, you need the role admin. So in a previous video, we talked about how we were managing roles when we sign in via Google. So we will sign in with my Gmail. My Gmail information loads directly from Google, and then we'll get the users. The users load, and you can see that my user was created, and it has a free user and it has a role admin. So I created these roles, I'm managing these roles, but I need to add them to the JSON Web Token that Google is using. I'm using Google's authorization server so that I can leverage Spring Security. So now if we try to create a new user, I was able to create a new random user. It'll populate in a second. But you can see that, okay, that means the role admin worked. And because it's even loading the users, as you can see, it loaded these users here. That just shows you that, okay, I have the free user role. I can try to delete a user, but it doesn't work because I don't have the appropriate roles to perform that action. I don't have the subscriber role. So let's go through this. This is really cool. It's marrying roles that we are managing ourselves with the authorization server Google is managing for us, and we are enriching that JSON Web Token to use OAuth 2 with Spring Security. The objectives for today is code review objectives. Extract the JWT authorities manually. So Spring Security will extract authorities, your roles, for you, but it expects that the JSON Web Token will have a scope attribute or otherwise include the roles. However, our JWT from Google does not have this information. We have to manage it ourselves. Google has no idea what I'm building, what my code looks like, has no idea what my roles are. So we have to manage this stuff ourselves. We need roles loaded during the authentication that Spring Security is doing in order to leverage these pre-authorized checks. So for pre-authorized to work, before we even hit this, before we get here, the authentication object needs to be populated from the JSON Web Token, and it has to know what the user corresponding to that JWT is and what their roles are. We'll add role-based protection to our API endpoints. So once we've done this first part with authorities, we can then use PreAuthorize, which I've shown you. And then we'll extend the AuthenticationPrincipal annotation to return a custom user entity that we want. So with other Spring Security authentication methods, authentication principal would return a user, like a regular user, using a custom user service. But with JWT authentication, a JWT authentication token is returned. So this isn't that helpful for us, but we'd like to have automatically as the current user. And so we create a custom annotation to do that. All right, so how do you extract the JWT authorities manually? Well, unfortunately for everybody, you have to consult the documentation. And Spring documentation is what it is. So they have, we're in this part for OAuth 2 resource server, JWT. You scroll down to configuring authorization. And ultimately what this is going to say is, oh, this is how you get it because it's in your token. Well, it's actually not in my token, so I have to continue on to extract authorities manually. And ultimately what it says is, to this end, Spring Security ships with a JWT authentication converter, which is responsible for converting a JWT into authentication. By default, it will use this one, but you can provide your own. Basically, and that's what we have to do. So Spring Security assumes your JWT JWT has the authorities, the roles embedded as an attribute. This does not match our use case. Google Sign-On is not tracking our role. Therefore, we must follow the docs. Quote, for more flexibility, the DSL supports entirely replacing the converter with any class that implements converter JWT, abstraction authentication token. Cool. So we kind of know what we're supposed to do. How do we do it? So we go to the security config, and we look at the security filter chain where we're setting this up. And the change that we make here is in OAuth2.jwt. We register our own JWT authentication converter, passing in a custom JWT authentication converter. This custom converter I have created. It's part of the security package. And what I did was, you saw in the docs that Spring said, okay, well, we give you a default. Well, I went and found their default here, and I just copied it verbatim so that my custom implementation was actually just the default implementation. Okay? So everything kind of compiled, everything worked the way it was working before. And then I looked in this convert function where they were setting, I'll just show you here. So they were setting these authorities here. So a collection of granted authorities. Authorities is coming from the JWT, convert the JWT. We can't use that, so I got rid of that line there. And I replaced it with my own custom logic. So once again, I'm using validate Google Auth token to verify the auth token. This returns me a user, or it just errors out if it can't return a valid user. We figure out if it's already an enabled user, and we have an empty list of authorities. If the user's present, then we get the existing user, and then we get the roles. We map the roles that they have, and we create new simple granted authorities for each role using the role name, right? So get name. So we're getting the name, which is the enum, which is this. And we're setting the roles, and then we're collecting them all to a list. And basically we're using that authorities list when we create the JWT authentication token. So this file is going to be hit as part of our security filter chain. It gets here before it even hits the endpoint that we want to hit, and it's setting up our authentication object with JWT and OAuth2. And the authorities that it's setting when it creates that token are what we are creating. So I imported the repository I needed, and I'm loading those users from the database here. And then we're registering it here. Looks pretty simple. When you know what to do, it is simple. It actually took me a while to get that to work. So I started with Spring Security's default instance here, and then I replaced their authorities with my own. So this is how we're creating an authentication object that actually has the roles that we've created and that we're managing on the back end. We add role-based protection to our API endpoints. So Spring Security comes with a PreAuthorize annotation for securing endpoints. This annotation will check an authenticated user's authorities against the has role value. So it'll check your authorities, and does it have a role that matches this? Does it have a role that matches this? To use PreAuthorize, you have to have EnableMethodSecurity on. And so we just added EnableMethodSecurity to our security config. And then, as I showed you before in the controller, we added PreAuthorize, and we added the roles, and these match the role names. And so because in our custom JWT authentication converter, we created this list of new simple granted authorities just using the name, the enum name that we got from the database. We were able to leverage the already existing PreAuthorize tag, which was really, really nice. So now we have controllers that both require authentication and specific roles. That's huge. You can't really have it without that. You can't really build much of an app without having a role-based protection. So then we're at the last part. So we want to extend the authentication principal which is something that comes with Spring Security, returns sometimes a user, but in our case, it does not return a user. And we want it to return one of our user entities. So we want to automatically load a user entity as part of a valid authentication. If we know somebody is already a user, we've created a user or they're already a user, let's just immediately populate that user object. So we create a custom current user annotation. So it's a custom annotation, and it is the AuthenticationPrincipal annotation, and then we use Spring's SPEL expressions to say, take every time you load current user, load authenticated principal, and run the user service implementation get user from JWT, passing in this, and this value is what the authentication principal would give you. So if we go look at user service, we have get user from JWT, and it takes the JWT authentication token object, which is this, which is what comes from Spring Security's built-in authentication principal. So we take that, and then we return a user from our database associated with the principal. Otherwise, it's null. So all we do is, once again, validate the token because it'll validate and return a user. We find that user entity, and we return it. And if we can't find it or it's invalid, we'll just return null. But this custom annotation now is always going to run get user from JWT using the authentication principal JWT authentication object. So what we do is automatically load the user in an endpoint. So in our create user, we use the @currentUser, and it will populate this user object and this variable with the current user associated with the JWT, which is awesome. So once again, go to user controller and create user. You can see I have it here, and it actually prints out the current user. So if we go to here, you can see that when I hit something, it said current user. ID 1, Peter last name, PGL Industries. So we can do that again. So I will create a user, created a new random user. Sure enough, it printed current user, and it does the toString. So that's it. It's kind of a shorter one, but like a lot went into this. But what you have now is a very powerful web app. It's, I can't stress this enough. You're able to set and manage roles automatically on the back end. You're built in with an authentication authorization server with JWT with Google. So you have a Gmail, and it'll validate that. It'll give me the JWT, which just has your name and your email. I'll create a user, I'll give you roles, and then I'll control what you do based on that. So Spring Security is up and running, the front end with Angular is up and running, our Postgres database is running, our single sign-on's running. It doesn't look like much on the UI because we haven't cleaned it up, but functionally it's pretty dope. So yeah, subscribe for more. We're going to keep building this out, but I hope you like this, and check out the code and like, subscribe, all that good stuff. All right, thanks.